All right, everybody. In this video, as promised, I'll be wrapping up this introduction to feminist interpretations of ethics and leading into an ethics of care. All right, so just to recap some of the things that I talked about primarily in the previous video regarding why traditional moral theories are largely incomplete or inadequate to account for all relevant moral phenomena. So the history of traditional moral theories is largely seen as being in service to what I call the public domain of life. So the area of politics and economics, and being out in the workforce and these kinds of things. And the reason why that's the case is because according to sort of a classical liberal model of political philosophy and the human individual, kind of the human individual is seen as a basic organism, a primitive organism in a social unit, or a primitive in a social organism, I think I said. And that sort of atomic individual is seen as being inherently self-interested, rational, and free. So most of our moral relationships with each other in society are understood as sort of mutually binding contractual arrangements. So I, as a citizen of the United States, interact with other citizens of the United States in certain ways. And there's a social contract here which applies to both parties univocally, right? So I agree to treat you in certain ways, you agree to treat me in certain ways, and yada, yada, yada. Now, but the problem here is twofold. So one, this kind of model can't account for the empirical fact that we don't come into the world as inherently rational, free, and self-interested individuals. We come into the world completely vulnerable and dependent upon our parents or our guardians or our caregivers, right? And this relationship, the parent-child relationship, is not only a morally important relationship, but this is the other horn, it's also a socially important relationship. Okay, so if ethics, historically and traditionally speaking, has only been of service in the public domain of life and has had nothing to say about the private domain, precisely because traditional moral theories have operated on the assumption that, well, that ethics has nothing to do with that. So when we're doing ethics, we're concerned with justice and civil liberties and respect for rights and doing what is fair, and we've got to be impartial and we've got to be objective, and the rules and the principles that we operate by morally need to be universalizable and they need to apply to all rational beings in all circumstances. Okay, so whether you are talking about the principle of utility or whether you're talking about Kant's categorical imperatives, doesn't matter. There's an emphasis here on the rational objectivity, impartiality, and equal consideration between parties, all of those kinds of things. Okay, so ethics has had largely nothing to say about the private area of life because the assumption that was made here is that concerns about what's public and concerns about what's private, there's a sharp distinction between the two. So your political life doesn't intersect with your private life. So the way you were raised and who your parents are, that's all the home life. So when you go out into the public and you go out to vote, your private life and your public life are completely separable from each other, right? So you, as a citizen of the United States, as this kind of rational, free, self-interested individual in a social organism or a social unit, you may have a private life, but when you're a political animal, the private and the political should not intersect or do not intersect. Now, but that is clearly false, right? For a couple of reasons. First of all, anybody who's been to a grocery store on a Saturday morning when other parents are out shopping with their kids has those moments where they look at other children and go, yeah, I can see what kind of grown up you're going to be. I mean, so the idea that how we are raised and the kinds of parents we have has no impact whatsoever on who we become as adults. I mean, that is clearly false. I mean, so as one feminist philosopher says, every great leader that there's ever been, or every horrible leader that there's ever been in society, had a mother first, right? That's where we all begin. So clearly, the kind of home life you have and the kind of familial unit you come from, the kinds of caregivers that you have when you are completely dependent and vulnerable, that plays a heavy role in who you are going to become as a rational, self-interested, and free citizen of a country, right? So the idea that the private life doesn't intersect with the public life, I mean, that's false on those grounds. Now, but it's also false on the grounds, given the way that societies politically and economically are organized, right? So there are individuals whose lives are daily encumbered by certain political and public policies. Okay, so the phrase that often gets used here, among feminist philosophers in particular, is that the personal is political, right? So I have blue eyes, and if there were a group of people, a group of non-blue-eyed people who wanted to pass a law making it so that blue-eyed people aren't allowed to vote, right? I would have something to say about that. My wife also has blue eyes. All of our children have blue eyes. So we all would have something to say about that. Now, but what if somebody said this? Well, John, the only reason you're objecting to this law is because you have blue eyes. I mean, wouldn't that be absurd? I mean, so if we try to pass a law making it so that blue-eyed people are not allowed to vote, how is bringing up the fact that I have blue eyes? How is bringing that fact up an objection to my criticism? If somebody says, well, you're allowing your own personal circumstances to affect how you vote. You're allowing your own personal circumstances to affect, your view of politics. Okay, but everybody does that. Everybody does that. Everybody votes personally. So this idea that as political animals we are required to be completely objective and impartial. I mean, one, nobody does this, and it's actually impossible to be completely impartial and objective in our public lives. Okay, now, but it's also clearly easier for some people in society to separate their private life from their public life. Okay, so if you are able to separate who you are politically with who you are personally and privately, that's a pretty clear indication that you occupy a position of privilege. I mean, so particularly white cisgender, straight males. I mean, there aren't any systemic issues facing me as a white cisgender male, right? There have not been any past formalized forms of discrimination or segregation against, people that fall into my demographic. All right. So part of the reason why I don't really, I don't know, see the political landscape as affecting me personally is because I've never been a member of an underrepresented or marginalized or oppressed or exploited demographic. So, I mean, if you're sitting in a position where you say, you know what, when I look at the way how society is organized, when I look at the laws, when I look at the statistics, when I, hear members of other demographics give testimony, they share their anecdotal evidence about what it's like, being a person of color in the United States, or being a woman in the United States, or being a gay individual, or being a lesbian, or being bisexual, or being a transgendered individual. These kinds of things, somebody who is genderqueer. When we hear anecdotal and testimonial evidence coming from these groups of individuals and individuals that fall in these demographics about how the the deck seems to be stacked against them. We need to pay attention to that because, I mean, somebody like me, I can't personally identify with that. Okay, so for many people, the personal is political. So if you're a member of a demographic where there are systemic barriers to your self-fulfillment, and there's a historical precedent behind this, so there have been past on legally on the books forms of formalized racism or sexism or homophobia and things like that that our country is still dealing with. This is why you can't simply look at the letter of the law and make determinations about whether things like racism and sexism and homophobia still exist. So here's an example that I used for another individual. If we've been dumping raw sewage in the Great Lakes for 100 years, and then all of a sudden we make it illegal, like we change the law. So it's legal for 100 years, and then we change the law so that it's now illegal, right? Does changing the law undo the 100 years of harm that we caused to the Great Lakes? I mean, magically, do all the effects of this policy that we had for 100 years just magically go away? No, of course not. So given the fact that we have had formalized on the law, as far as the law is concerned, as far as the letter of the law is concerned, racism and sexism and homophobia and things like that, codified in law. And having these laws on the books has affected the way society is organized and the very institutions we have and sort of our unconscious biases and these sorts of things. Simply changing the law, the Civil Rights Act didn't end racism or sexism at all. I mean, that was already part of our social consciousness, and you don't change the social consciousness. You don't change what we value as a society. You don't change institutions and power dynamics, whether that be socio-politically or economically. You don't change those kinds of things just by changing the law. So our communities were largely racially segregated, during Jim Crow and during, prior to the Civil Rights Acts and things like that. And changing the law didn't unsegregate our communities, right? To this day, racially, we are still spatially and socially segregated into certain kinds of communities. So changing the law doesn't change that kind of, demographic makeup. Okay, so that is why the personal is still political for members of historically marginalized and publicly underrepresented groups. Okay, so this idea that the private and the public are completely separable from each other, no, that's just nonsense. Okay, now, so as far as what's going to be what might uniquely characterize an ethics of care as opposed to the traditional moral theories. So whereas traditional moral theories, as I mentioned, have been focused on being objective and impartial in the application of principles and rules, moral principles and rules like justice and beneficence and non-maleficence, an ethics of care is going to rest on the fact that our moral relationships are very deeply shaped by interpersonal dynamics. So we bear certain obligations to some individuals that we don't bear to others precisely because of interpersonal dynamics that hold between them. So I have certain obligations towards members of my own family, primarily my wife and my children, well, and even my cat who's staring at me right now, wondering what I'm doing. I have certain obligations towards them that I don't have towards strangers, right? So, and I don't want to be dark, but I am not morally obligated to run into a burning building to save a complete stranger's child. I'm not a firefighter. So I'm not, and by that, what I mean is I'm not required to put my own life at risk for a complete stranger's child. However, I think I am required to put my own life at risk for my own children. So if my house were on fire and my children were trapped inside, I think I would be doing something wrong by not risking my own life to save my own children. I buy my children birthday presents and presents during the holidays and things like that. I unless they're members of my family or close friends, I don't do this for other people's children. I don't buy complete strangers' children birthday presents. Now, but what if you came to me and said, "Oh, what did you get your daughter, your middle daughter for her birthday?" And I say, "Oh, I don't buy my daughter presents." How many of you would think I'm not a very good parent? I mean, you should be sort of what kind of parent doesn't celebrate their children's birthdays? I mean, there are people that don't do it for religious reasons, but that's not what I mean. I just mean I don't feel any need to invest in my children in that kind of way. Oh, I don't tell them stories or tuck them in at night. This is what you do as a parent, but I'm not required to do that with other people's kids, right? It's not my job to care for them. So I'm the caregiver of my own children, and precisely because they're my children. Okay, so given the fact that our moral relationships to each other are largely shaped by interpersonal dynamics, and some feminists characterize this as some of those interpersonal dynamics are involuntary, like between mothers and their children or fathers and their children. Others are voluntary. So customer proprietor relationships, these are voluntary, like I said in the previous video. If I walk into a store and I don't like that store's prices, I can purchase those goods and services elsewhere, right? I can shop around in a free market. Okay. Now, but since our moral relationships to each other are largely shaped by interpersonal dynamics, some interesting things follow. Okay, so first of all, a ethics of care, a feminist understanding of ethics, doesn't sort of demonize our emotions and our sentiments as leading us astray. Um, an ethics of care embraces our emotional and sentimental attachments. Okay, so one I mentioned in the previous video was this notion of joy. So as a parent, I should be finding joy in my children and delighting in my children. And one thing that is required with love, and I mean, I could do an entire lecture series on love. Part of what is required for a loving relationship is bearing another person's sorrows and sufferings as one's own. Not only their sufferings and their sorrows, but also their joys. I mean, so if I love my wife, her sorrows become mine. Her interests become mine. So what we have with a loving relationship like that is we have kind of two wills becoming united as one. Okay, and there's times where certain kinds of emotional or sentimental reactions are not only morally appropriate but are morally required. So, traditional utilitarians and deontologists, I mean, Kant is a perfect example here. Kant has nothing nice to say about our emotions. It's our emotions which lead us astray, because when we're emotional, we're not being rational. And, morality is all about reason. So, I mean, you can hear the kind of like bent towards masculine ways of thinking about ourselves and masculine ways of thinking about ethics here. If ethics is all based on reason and emotion and sentiment has no role to play, I mean, philosophers in the past, Kant included, have gone so far as to say that women must look to men for their moral guidance. Why? Because women are more emotional and sentimental, and since women are more emotional and sentimental, they're less likely to make the correct kinds of moral decisions and kinds of things. And I mean, this is just crazy talk, right? Okay, now, so no, your emotions matter. Your sentiments matter, right? Okay, now, an ethics of care also allows for partiality and context sensitivity in our moral considerations. All right. The moral landscape is much too complex. The moral landscape is much too complex to fit into neat, abstract, universalizable moral principles. So we can all agree that justice is important. We can all agree that beneficence is important. We can all agree that non-maleficence is important. That's true. What's much more difficult is to apply these abstract rules and principles in concrete circumstances. In concrete circumstances, our obligations are going to conflict. with each other. So in a concrete circumstance, you might be in a situation where the just thing, doing the just thing, conflicts with doing the beneficent thing or the non-maleficent thing. Okay, now, so in cases of conflict, on what basis do we make decisions about how to go? Okay, well, those who advocate feminism or an ethics of care is going to say, okay, well, focus on your sentiments, focus on your emotions, focus on those interpersonal dynamics here. So with my children, am I going to be more concerned with treating my children justly, or am I going to be more concerned with protecting my children from harm? Right? Now, that doesn't mean that justice has no role to play in the home life. I mean, clearly it does. So, if my son and my middle daughter are fighting over a toy, what am I going to do? I'm going to take the toy away from both of them, and nobody's going to play with it. The toy is going to go up on a shelf. Here, I'm doing what's fair. I'm doing what's just. So the idea here is, once again, it's not that justice and fairness have no application in the home life at all. They clearly do, but the home life and parent-child relationships and appropriate, the moral context of parenting cannot be fully articulated in terms of things like justice and fairness and beneficence and non-maleficence. That's the idea. Okay, so justice is not only a social phenomena which exists in the public domain of life. It also exists in the private domain of life. Okay, now, and what we mean by partiality here is that I am allowed morally, and this just seems to be common sense, I am allowed to put the interests of my children over and above the interests of other people's children. Now, that doesn't mean I get to harm other people's children to satisfy my children's interests, but the fact that I spend more money on my own kids than I do donating to charity, that's fine. I'm not morally required to give as much to other people's, to complete strangers' children as I give to my own children. And if I had to choose between taking my kids out to the movies or donating that money to charity, I don't think I'm doing anything wrong by taking my kids to the movies. And, if you want to be an objective utilitarian, oh, well, but there's so much more good that you could be doing with that money. I mean, you could be donating that money and feeding starving children. Yeah, I could be doing that. But what would I'd be missing out on certain goods with my own children. So I'll still donate money to charity, sure, but every extra penny that I might spend on my own children just to have a day of fun with them and invest with them or invest in their lives as my children, that's just as important, if not more important. So I am absolutely morally permitted to be partial to my own members of my own family. Absolutely. Okay. Now, and if we had to characterize the notion of a caring relationship, kind of in a cheesy kind of way, it would be according to with what we could call the 3 R's: receptivity, responsiveness, and relatedness. Okay, so this is why caring relationships are different than just merely promoting another person's well-being. Okay, so I can promote another person's well-being in a certain way that actually violates them, right? So this comes up in cases of what's known as medical paternalism. So in medical context, you act paternalistically, coming from the Latin term pater, which means father. To act paternalistically towards another individual is to act in a way that's in their best interest, even if they don't desire it, right? So if you're fully rational and autonomous and you don't want to go through medical treatment, I would be acting paternalistically if I violate your wishes and treat you against your will. Okay, now, so that might be beneficent, because if I, as a medical expert, I might rest on my expertise as a medical expert and say, well, this individual just doesn't, they're just not fully informed to the same extent that I am. So even though they're telling me they don't want to go through with treatment, I'm going to manipulate them into doing it or deceive them into doing it. Okay, so that might be medically beneficent. I might be promoting their good, at least, and part of the problem here is their good is understood primarily in terms of prolonging their life and avoiding their death. But I mean, that's problematic in its own right. However, a caring relationship treats human beings not just as like individual lives, and our main concern is just promoting their longevity of life and avoiding their death. A caring relationship takes our psychological well-being and our emotional well-being, our spiritual or our religious well-being into account as well. Okay, so I mean, take my children. If I have to take my child to the doctor and I know that she is afraid, just telling her to suck it up and no, what should I do? I should acknowledge her fear and respond to her as somebody who is nervous and anxious. Just coming in, suck it up, stop whining, you're going to the doctor, you'll be fine. Failing to acknowledge my daughter's fear and failing to um, acknowledge the fact that she's anxious and affirm her even despite her fear and her anxiety, um, and being just as deeply concerned with her emotional and psychological well-being as much as I am with her physical well-being. That would be caring. So the difference here is I can act to promote another individual's good. I can act beneficently towards another individual for reasons other than it's for their good. But a caring relationship does take the motivations behind the individual giving care into account. All right. Now, so receptivity involves listening and hearing what an individual is saying. I'm afraid, I'm scared, I need to be affirmed, I need to feel loved and cherished and those kinds of things. So that would be, if my children ask me, do you love me? I'm like, what are you talking about? You're right. That's not being receptive, and that's not responding appropriately in a caring kind of way. All right. This involves compassion. This involves nurture. It involves an openness and a vulnerability, right? So most of the time, I'm the one caring for my children, but sometimes my children care for me. I'll have one of my children just come up to me if I'm having a bad day and say, give me a hug and say, you look like you needed a hug, right? That's being receptive and being responsive, right? And we build each other up. We make each other better people when we engage in this kind of receptive and responsive and context sensitive um, being in family with each other. Okay, now, so what a feminist ethicist or someone who articulates an ethics of care is going to say is that these kinds of concerns, which are largely historically and traditionally identified with the home life, with the private life, things like compassion and nurture and vulnerability and care, these are just as important in other moral contexts as they are in the private home life context. So instead of seeing ourselves as inherently rational and free and self-interested individuals who are just engaged in relationships from some sort of contractual arrangement. No, even as adults, we have emotional and psychological needs that go beyond what respect for rights or demanding respect for rights can do. So justice only goes so far. Demanding that my rights be respected and just giving other individuals a bare minimum amount of respect that they're entitled to just as a rational, free, and self-interested individual in society. That's not good enough. I mean, that is not the whole picture of the moral dynamics. Okay, so once again, someone who advocates an ethics of care is once again not trying to supplant traditional moral theories. The claim here is that, yeah, even though justice and things like beneficence and non-maleficence are important, these things are too abstract. So to put some meat on the bones of ethics, to have more of a practical concern, we need to be context sensitive, and we need to incorporate the fact that holistically we are not just rational creatures. We are emotional creatures. We are sentimental creatures. We are vulnerable and largely dependent upon each other as members of this species. All right. Okay, so I hope this short unit was informative, and as always, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to email me. Thank you.